David, I've been fascinated for a long time with the question of the so-called soul, the immortal soul. What is it from a neuroscience point of view? Is it any way justifiable? And even from a biblical point of view, do we find any evidence? Because certainly many religions teach the immortality of the soul. What's the teaching and the history of the immortal soul within Judaism?
Well, I think there are some references in the Bible to it, though, or at least that could be taken that way. For example, references to this place called Sheol, where souls go after the person dies. There's also Genesis 2:7 speaks about God breathing, quote, nishmat chayim into man. Now, that phrase, that means literally breath of life. And it can be taken two ways. It could simply mean he became an animate creature. That's one way of understanding it. But there is a way of understanding it in which he's sort of breathing the soul in. I don't think it would be a strong proof whether or not later on belief in the immortality of the soul, but once you have that belief, you can go back and read it that way, as many have. Jewish literature in general is permeated with belief in the soul. In the Talmud, though, resurrection of the dead is stressed more than the immortality of the soul. I think it's important to see a distinction, though, between sort of the classic way in which immortality was conceived by Plato and the way it's conceived by, I'll pick Maimonides as my sample here. In Plato, the body dies. It's in the nature of the soul to be immortal. That's anybody's soul, right? It could be Mussolini's soul. Right, is an immortal soul. In Maimonides, it's much different, and I think it emerges really as a very, very nice and poignant idea. The idea is, in Maimonides put a lot of emphasis on the intellect, and he saw development of the intellect as the ultimate way in which a person was going to achieve immortality. So when a person during his or her lifetime exercises the intellect properly, then that person unites with, in medieval metaphysics, these higher intellects and so forth, at least partially unites, and gains immortality by continuing simply what it was doing in this world. So it's as if the immortality of the soul in that case is the result of a natural process. What you're doing in this world is what you'll be doing in the next. Suppose you have a person who's not doing what he's supposed to do in this world. That person's soul just gets cut off. That's why Maimonides understands the term karet, which means cut off.
What does that mean,
cut off? It just means that the soul dissolves. It's not there. And that's because the soul is not
permanent, inherent immortality that's in its essence.
Its essence. Exactly right. Exactly the opposite, really, of Socrates. Yeah. Now, I mentioned intellectual contemplation is what the soul is supposed to do, but you can, maybe frame this differently. During one's lifetime, one is supposed to try to be close to God. That closeness to God results in a state such that after your body dies, you will continue. If you're not close to God during your lifetime, it's not that God necessarily punishes you by getting cut off. It's that you have no place in the next world because you're not close to God. The idea is that in immortality, where you wind up, whether you wind up immortal or not, depends on whether you wanted to wind up immortal. What I mean by that is the following. If you wanted to do the things during your lifetime that are required for immortality, then you'll achieve immortality. It's for those who really will appreciate that state. Those who don't appreciate the state of closeness to God or intellectual perfection, they're not going to make the cut. I mean, they'll be cut. Instead, they will be cut. And I think it's a very nice idea that those who don't value the things that one ought to be doing when the soul is immortal, just don't have immortal souls.
So based on this structure of the soul, what is the initial essence of the soul? Does the soul start out immortal, and that if you do not do some of these things you should do, be close to God, be intellectual, then God takes away something from what you had originally, and the soul is cut off? Or is it the opposite? The soul starts off not immortal, but if you do some of these things, then God adds something to it to make it immortal.
Well, I think the answer to this is that the soul is born with the potential for immortality. It's got to exercise its intellect or attempt to achieve closeness to God in order to reach a point where it can achieve immortality. So really, immortality is in your hands, and if you don't do the proper things, then just in the natural course of things, you'll be cut off. It doesn't even necessarily mean that God is going to punish you by cutting off your soul. See, the plain meaning of the biblical text is that God cuts off your soul. But I think somebody like Maimonides could understand this as a natural process by which the soul is destroyed.
So under that theory, which maybe is a little bit unique, everybody sort of has a kind of almost a real metaphysical or ontological, in the sense of the real essence of their own soul. What happens to it is based upon what they do themselves.
That's right. This life, there is a term that's used, olam haba, which means the world to come. Now in the Talmud, what that means is some distant point in the future. Maimonides kind of transformed what it meant, and he took it to mean that after a person dies, he enters this place called Olam Haba, the world to come, immediately after he dies. And in that world, he will be thinking and contemplating and so forth. So it's a kind of new meaning to the term. But what I think is really striking here is that you can live, even while you're in the body, in an Olam Haba orientation. So the body doesn't have to be a prison, as Socrates says it does. You can actually live the world to come while you're embodied.